You're listening to the Slavic Literature Pod, your shelf help guide to all things Slavic. I'm Cameron Lalana, and if you want to learn more about Slavic literature, art, and culture, then you're in the right place. Today, after a long time away, we're coming back to Chekhov with the book Anton Chekhov, Earliest Stories, Novellas, Humoresques, 1880 to 1882. This annotated collection brings together 58 of Chekhov's earliest published works, all work done years before he would start publishing under his own name. Joining me today to talk about it is the book's editors, Rosamund Bartlett and Elena Michajlowska. Thank you both so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
No, it's good to be here. Thanks.
Hi there. Great to be here.
Before we talk about the book itself, I wanted to talk to the two of you about yourselves, about your backgrounds, your relationship with Chekhov, and your involvement with the Anton Chekhov Foundation. And maybe I have some questions about the early Chekhov translation project as it relates in this book, so maybe we can talk about that a little later as well.
Would you like to start, Rosamund? It all began with you.
Okay. Yeah, this is going to be tricky for us because there's two of us here. So I was very lucky to get to learn Russian at school when I was 14 years old and ended up going to do a Russian degree at university. And then, I don't know, it seems like the subject chose me. I went on to do a doctorate, and actually I was veering off into a career writing about the history of opera in Russia. And then I got this job teaching at the University of Michigan for a few years, and they gave me these courses on 19th century Russian literature to teach. And it was a sort of education for me, actually, teaching them. But it was actually a revelation too, teaching Chekhov, who I'd studied a bit at undergraduate level, but not very much, because a lot of the students who enrolled for my class were not in the class because they were doing a degree in Russian literature in any way, but because they were creative writers. And for them, Chekhov was a god. And it was such a sort of eye-opener for me, because they thought he was just a really great writer. And they were such enthusiasts. And when I was in Ann Arbor, I organized a conference on Shostakovich and gave a paper there myself on Shostakovich and Chekhov, because I found this amazing statement about one of Chekhov's stories being written in sonata form. And so a little bit later on, I had the idea for doing new translations of his stories for the 100th anniversary of his death in 2004. And just completely to my surprise, I sort of took a completely different direction from writing the book I still have a contract for on the history of opera in Russia, because an invitation to write a biography of Chekhov fell into my lap, and I wasn't going to say no.
Right.
And then one of the publishers who turned down my proposal for the short story anthology that I was translating asked me to do the letters. So I ended up suddenly with 3 Chekhov books in 1 year. And I had the most amazing time, because he's such an inspiring writer. And they all came out, those books, in 2004. And then a few years later, I was invited to curate some programs on Chekhov as a short story writer that was being funded by a venture capitalist in London who contacted Pushkin House, which is our Center for Russian Literature and Culture. And that was how I met the wonderful Elena, who I've been working with now for almost 20 years. And it's been incredible working with her, actually. And we ended up forming this campaign to raise money to restore Chekhov's house in Yalta. And so I think this is a good moment to hand over to you, Elena.
Right. Yes, that's right. It was an American venture capitalist who introduced us to each other. At that time, I was working in documentaries and putting together cultural events in London. And he saw one of the films, one of my films, and also was interested, invited me over for a lunch, and we had a long conversation. And that's when we talked about Chekhov, and he had it in mind to introduce me to Rosamund, because Rosamund started this campaign, and he saw that I'll be the capable asset as a project manager, helping her to deal with authorities in Ukraine, because Yalta and Crimea were in Ukraine at the time. So that's Chekhov was and is my favorite Russian writer, mainly because he's so forgiving to us humans and our imperfections, unlike Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, who do judge us harshly. And also, I was at school in the 90s, growing up in Vladivostok, and it was an equivalent of British grammar school, gymnasia, slightly different to your normal comprehensive. And suddenly, after the Soviet Union collapse, the teachers were allowed to teach more than the Soviet curriculum, because simply they had no new curriculum, and it was up to them to introduce what they wanted. And we had an amazing Russian literature teacher, Tatiana Dmitrievna. She managed to squeeze into the Soviet curriculum Solzhenitsyn, Pasternak's letters to Tsvetaeva, We by Zamyatin, and all this wealth of information was coming to us. So we were overwhelmed how big our literary heritage really is compared to what it was, how it was presented just by the Soviet authorities. But one constant remained. It was Chekhov, because nothing changed. He was how he was. I mean, the Soviet authorities did try to appropriate him and kind of use him as a voice of a little man and so on, but he didn't fit. He didn't fit into the ideology, and so I thought, he was the one always standing out for me. So when this American philanthropist and venture capitalist asked me to meet Rosamund, I thought, I'll definitely help her to preserve the house that Chekhov built himself. It's local authorities that they just were not funding it, because they had no funds themselves, and obviously he was somewhere down the line, and the Russian authorities weren't going to do anything because Crimea was in Ukraine. So we met, we hit off, and we started the Yalta Chekhov campaign, which was really a success, I would say, and culminating with big celebrations of Chekhov 150th at the Hampstead Theatre in London, with a lot of big names and coming in, like actress Rosamund Pike and Miriam Margolis, and they did performances the whole week, and we raised enough and helped to restore their archival building, and the rest was done by the then president of Ukraine. Sadly, because of the annexation, we were unable to continue working with them, and had to stop, because we had plans to restore the garden which Chekhov planted too, and that's how our other project, the therapeutic Chekhov garden, was born out of it. But it's probably for another conversation. It's not a book. So, but it was after this, after we succeeded with the restoration campaign, it was Rosamund's idea to invite translators of all abilities to look at the earliest Chekhov stories, the volume 1 in this kind of wide collection on the shelf, and see take one on first come, first served basis, and see what comes out of it.
It's a pretty crazy idea.
Yeah.
We know it now.
I think we should also mention that when we got going with our campaign, we decided that we found it so rewarding to be working on things related to Chekhov that we decided to set ourselves up as a UK charity. So we are the Anton Chekhov Foundation. and we don't have an office or anything, but we take on projects. And so, yeah, the first one was raising money for the house, and that was wonderful back then. I got to know the director then. She, in the old days, all those literary museums used to be run by scholars. So she was a kind of colleague of mine. And then, yeah, the garden project was great. And then, yeah, we launched the early Chekhov translation project, as a way to promote the study of Russian language. I think it's probably the case in the States as well as in the UK that language numbers are going down. It's getting harder and harder to study languages, in university. So that was one of the aims, and also to give anyone a chance to have a go at literary translation, because it's actually very hard to get contracts at the high level when you're dealing with the sort of the classics of a literature. So with juvanalia, we're not dealing with very sophisticated form, but it gives you the opportunity to get completely immersed in the language, and to, we weren't quite sure, were we, Elena, at the beginning, how it was going to work out, but we hoped that one day we might have a book, and finally we have a publication.
Here we are.
Well, as you know, I was going to bring it up later, but as long as we're talking about it, let's talk about the early Chekhov translation project, and having 85 translators working through all of this, which was, and if you pick up the book, and I hope you do, there is a little note on the story of the translations, as well as biographies for most of the translators involved in the project, which is really cool. And if you are a listener who's listened for a long time, you might actually see one or two familiar names in there who have appeared on the show before. So let's talk a little bit more about the early Chekhov translation project.
Elena, do you want to talk about the nuts and bolts of how we went about launching it?
Yes.
Because Elena is also the technical brains here. She's really brilliant with computers and things. So
I'm going to be blushing here, but luckily UK early dawn does not have to be seen. Well, as we said, rather audaciously and confidently, we launched the project
with a party.
With a party at an art gallery in London, where students of drama school, Rose Burford Drama School, did Cabaret Chekhov. There some merry early pieces, but not from our volume, slightly later put together. We said we're gonna just put out the calls and see who comes, and we also had this wonderful Ukrainian assistant, Ina Birchenko, who is horticulturist, but she was studying at the time, and was able to help us part-time with the project management. So we've put out a call, and within, I think, 3 days, all 58 stories were taken. But the reason there are more translators, because some of them were in groups, some of them were school kids in Winchester College, some of them were university students doing it as a project, and the breadth of geography, professions, from professional translators and Russian scholars to one Mongolian activist. So you really have a lot, and really uneven. So we assigned them honestly when they came. We allocated what they asked for, if it was available, and set deadlines, and all of them broke that. None of them came back.
That's amazing for such a large group.
Yeah, I know, all of them. None of them delivered on time. Our idea was to get them to collaborate with each other. So that's why we don't have names to particular stories. It's because we've once they did come back to us, we put out a call to see if anyone would like to help their other fellow project participants to do the edit. So they came back and then a couple more people would go through the same translation and do their suggestions and so on. So we had a lot of iterations.
It was a very open peer review process,
Mm.
which was really nice, actually. But we also had another helper, didn't we?
That came later,
Later.
Amanda.
Amanda was later,
Yeah.
wasn't she? Yes, I'm getting confused with the chronology now. Yeah.
No, well, because it took forever. And as I said, it mainly at the beginning because not everyone delivered on time. And when they did, we went for the peer review. So we got another version and another version. And then Rosamund and I started looking at them and found that we couldn't see it as a book. That we and both of us, because we were volunteers, we were at such point in our lives that we couldn't commit to sitting down for hours and looking at it non-stop. So that's when this kind lady, Amanda Calvert, who worked as a translator and lived in Moscow for years, I think 30 years, and I
30
think she
years, I
translated
think.
for Bolshoi Theatre, didn't she? She came to us as a godsend, and she was able to go through all of them in pretty much one go, chronologically, one after another, and put it into the manuscript. And that's when Rosamund and I began working on it.
But we also had time finally in 2020 because we were both at home. And we ended up having these marathon phone conversations because we went through every single word of every single story, sometimes more than once. And the progress was actually very small and very slow to begin with. If the prose was, difficult, there were, lots of obscure references and lots of sort of strange bits of language that Chekhov uses that had us in fits of giggles, actually. But we worked with all the different versions and then discussed between ourselves how best to produce a manuscript that was, unified in the end, wouldn't you say, Elena?
Well, if you're interested in the technical aspects, in the end, we've put Microsoft Doc in the landscape and side by side the original final translators version after the peer review, then Amanda's version, and on top of that, all our comments and edits, and then after that, the cleaner version. The manuscript was horrendous; it could barely open. Some of the stories had to be broken down.
In fact, you and I both did revised versions of every story as well, separately, and then we brought them
we would
together.
call each other, and
Yeah.
and it's not like we argued, but what we've encountered is some. First of all, these early stories have a lot of context in who Chekhov was at the time, who his friends were. Their names are all there. That's why we have really extensive endnotes. You should really go through them. They a story on their own. So not every translator looked at that, and thus they lost the context, and also some stylized it to make it sound like Victorian fiction for some reason. It was just really oddities, and you could also see some translators putting themselves ahead of Chekhov. It sounded beautiful, but they would just enjoy their own prose more, and would stray so far from the original that even though it read beautifully, it wasn't what it was in Anton Chekhov.
Yeah, we did aim for accuracy, didn't we? We really wanted to make sure we got because there were some, translators with all the best will in the world, they missed words and phrases out, so that was the great virtue of us going through with a fine tooth comb at the end. And it was a very rewarding but very very tiring process to do it, wasn't it?
It was, but when we had it in the end, something like 528 pages manuscript, the Word file. It was a real hallelujah moment.
I can only imagine.
And the other thing to say about the Victorianization of Chekhov's prose, I mean, he is a writer who, even in his very early stories, sounds very contemporary. I mean, some of the references are obscure, but he's still using a language which sounds very fresh, doesn't he? It's very contemporary sounding.
Absolutely, and that's why it puzzled us why you would want to make him sound old-fashioned when the original does not does not sound. And another point that we really tried to preserve is the musicality, which he already had in his prose, even though it's not the elegiac prose of his later. Elegiac, sorry.
Yeah.
That's my that's my Russian. But it's more of a vaudeville type, or even some of them like that.
Well, there's a sort of theatricality to it, isn't it? There's a sort of performance. I mean, a lot of Russian readers used to want to read the stories out aloud, the later ones, and I think even at the early stage they sort of function well that way.
Yeah, I think vaudeville is a really good word for it. It kind of reminded me reading the earlier section of the book of being in a crowd at like a comedy show and having people come out and do their little routine. Like they've got a character they're going to come out and play. They switch to the next person. That was kind of the impression I got, as if these were being read out in succession on the stage.
Exactly, and one of the in one of the memoirs, his sister Maria. She said that Chekhov was the kind of comedian of their family. And when he was a schoolboy, he'd entertain them with these stand-up acts. You know, they had the home theater performances, but he in particular was really great and doing this absurd and over-the-top humor, which you find in the volume.
Yeah.
And the first time he went to the theatre was to see Offenbach's La Belle Hélène, you know, this uproarious operetta. And so that sort of vein of slapstick is there all the way through his work, actually. It's not always so well respected in productions of his later plays because you can get very maudlin with them, but it's always there.
That's something funny that this podcast always has to deal with books of this era. A lot of what we have to do is convince people, no, it's okay to laugh. It is funny. That was a joke. You can have fun with it. They people had humor before too.
Yeah, we should have said something about the just remembered the final sort of tutorials we had with some of our translators, because one of our translators was a graduate student in California, and it was amazing. It was just like this. We had a Zoom call, and it was so interesting, wasn't it, to go over queries and
Yes, one of the translators
to discuss things and
well,
give
it's
the
still being
translator
recorded. Maybe you can use some
opportunity
of the
to sort of
snippets.
clarify
One of
things.
one of the translators said that this project was a master class in translating. It really helped them to develop and see how it was, because once it was our turn to go through the volume, and we would send back the edited version to the translator, and they would put some queries to us. But some requested Zoom calls, and we had these conversations live with them, underlining the points and the choices were made and why it was and the reason. So we weren't just autocrats, taking over the book. We wanted to continue that spirit of collaboration, which was starting the project, because that was the whole point of it. Yeah, and now some of the translators, we've put out a call saying, would they like to do something in their university or in their community, and one became a librarian, and she said she's gonna in Chicago, I think, and in the States, sorry, and that she's going to do something there, and hopefully more will reply to that, and we'll continue that collaborative spirit of early Chekhov translation project.
I love that. That's so cool. I love that. That's so cool. Maybe I'm biased because my whole project is like, we can make this more accessible, but this is that's really awesome to hear. I love that.
No, we just really enjoying it, as much as it was hard. It was more it brought us a lot of joy, laughs, and um, kind of communicating with people. I mean, there were some bad communications. There were a few dropouts, which had to be replaced, but in the end, it's all worked out really well. And now that we're sending out those books to translators, they're overwhelmed to see all that work in paper, and it's so thick, as you know. They're actually holding it, so that tangible object at the moment. So no, it's been a rewarding journey, and perhaps some other literary charities of other languages will take on the model and will translate other works of.
I don't think anything like this has been done before, has it?
No. No one quite as crazy as we were. So no, but now it's been done, and we did have support, from some of your colleagues, Rosamund. They've been really admiring what we're doing and cheering us on. They're going, come on, you're doing a great job, carry on. I'm like, yes. Also, the pressure, we felt the pressure that we owe it to translators and everyone who's been involved. We owe it to them to come up with a book. And when it came to get it published, the problem was that it's so big. And, publishers would ask, oh, could you select the best of? But that's not the point. The point in this being chronological, all of it bare. As you know, there are some questionable points from the anti-Semitism and the treatment of women, and
I guess I also want to mention on that point actually that you need to have the wheat with the chaff, or the chaff with the wheat. I mean, it's really interesting to see some of the stories that work next to the ones which just don't. I mean, because not the standard is very, very uneven here. No one would ever claim this is great literature, but it's so interesting to see the whole thing. It's like I never understand it when people bring out editions of letters and they just quote from letters. You need the whole thing. You need how someone's addressed. You need how they sign off and things. You need all that context and things. So yeah.
Perhaps, Rosamund, you'd like to say a couple of words on Chekhov and anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire?
No, I don't want to. I think no. I mean, yeah, crude stereotypes. I mean, everyone unfortunately had a lot of prejudice against various things in Imperial Russia, and Chekhov was, susceptible to it. But what was remarkable was that, he grew up to be a very, very sensitive man, and more than anyone out of his generation in the writing community was deeply sensitive to minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities. Quite remarkable. He went out of his way to support them by making them real. Actually not ignoring them. Yeah.
And the same goes for his attitude to Ukraine. Besides him being partially Ukrainian, and as we discovered, the language was spoken freely in the household, as one of his brothers recalls that they even staged some plays in Ukrainian. He's tried to adapt Gogol for stage, and not for stage at home. And generally, what's really felt amazing to me, because obviously you're looking at the Russian Empire, and when we're doing this book, all these names which were late in the news, the war happening there, and like Bakhmut or Donetsk, and it was just so painful. But then next to them, Ukrainian phrases. This is peppered with quite few Ukrainian phrases. So I had to call on the Kievan friends and ask to verify the translations, and they were completely open to it, because I think Chekhov wasn't imperialist. If you look at his letters, you will see, even though there was no official border, he knew where Ukraine was exactly. Where Ukraine starts and Russia ends. He was really had a great admiration of that culture, and that was another point. Remember, Rosamund, when we're sort of we kept the Russian imperial names of the cities and towns, but we've made notes at the end to acknowledge what they are now. So that was another side. So I feel, this book, even though it's young and him being young and not as sensitive at that point, but he's still a good guy. He just essentially a really good soul in his core, and he proves that later.
Right. I mean, I think that's one of the great things about having young work like this is that some people are born very naturally empathetic in the way that Chekhov becomes, but there's also some people grow into it. And I think it's great to see an author who kind of, you can follow that journey from the young crude stereotypes into growing and learning and seeing their development. I think that's actually, a great thing. I mean, so much of this work is seeing the development from young to old, and it's fantastic to see that literarily, personally, empathetically. I think that's a great thing to have. It's great that we're talking about more of the work, but before we get too into it, maybe this is a good place. Usually at the start, we ask you to introduce sort of the author to our audience, but I'm going to say that probably if you're listening to this podcast, you are familiar with Chekhov, but maybe we could talk about the context of what's happening in Chekhov's life in the years that these stories are pulled from 1880 to 1882, which is, as he's starting to publish these stories under his pseudonyms.
Okay, shall I go for that one? So, so Chekhov, born in the southern town of Taganrog. His father was a grocer, and that meant that even though both his parents came from the peasantry originally, his father was born a serf, that they'd sort of pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. And Chekhov's father was a member of the merchant class, and that's so important in Russian culture, which class you belong to. And if you're a member of the merchant class, which was a very unstable one because you had to have money to keep that status, but you got to send your kids, if they were boys, to the grammar school, and then they could go to university. So that was absolutely amazing, and that's how Chekhov ended up becoming a medical student. So his father was an absolutely hopeless businessman, and he went bankrupt and fled to Moscow, and most of the family fled with him, leaving Chekhov behind for the last few years of his schooling. So he's born in 1860, on the eve of these great reforms, and so very turbulent times, 1860s, 1870s, and he arrives in Moscow in 1879 and starts writing in 1880 because he needs to earn money, and he gets paid 5 kopecks a line. And both his elder brothers, who are rather dissolute, are already involved in trying to work with the burgeoning press that there is there, because after the abolition of serfdom, the peasants start migrating to the cities to work in the factories, and there are more and more of these comic weeklies springing up. And Chekhov starts having a go, and he has to face being rejected. And in those days, you didn't get your story returned to you personally. You had to turn to the back of the magazine, to the rejections column, and you'd see a little notice, so and so. And so that was probably one reason why Chekhov used pseudonyms, actually, so that he could think up lots of different names. But eventually he got some good feedback, and we have the first story published in March 1880. And so our book is everything that he published between 1880 and 82, organized chronologically in the way that we have them in the Soviet complete collected works. And he's drawing from everything that he sees around him in his environment, plus because he's actually quite well read. And the book is full of parodies of some of the great writers like Victor Hugo and Jules Verne. And then there's one ridiculously long story towards the end of the volume, which was the result of a bet that Chekhov made with the editor of the magazine. And he said, I bet you I can write a story serialized over many issues, and the readers will think it's by this very popular contemporary Hungarian novelist Mór Yokai. And he pulled it off for a couple of months, and then the editor said, come on now, that's enough. So it's this massive, great story, which, is on its own already something which is probably not what one would expect from Chekhov, the master of the short story. It's a very varied volume, despite its being, very, very early in his career. So yeah, he stops it very, very abruptly. Anything else we need to say about the earlier?
We have an early Chekhov blog now that looks at this particular part of his life in greater detail, with a lot of quotes from the letters and the comms, and hopefully you'll find it entertaining. If you go to our website, you'll find the link there. And yes, Rosamund, absolutely right. Every single story has a link to some of autobiographical points in his life at the time. And as being Chekhov number 3, the third brother, he effectively became the head of the family in Moscow, because his father lived at his place of work at the merchant Gavrilov's household, and Chekhov became the head of the household, and he took that responsibility upon himself. He actually began submitting almost as soon as he arrived at the end of 1879. And he received far more rejections that he published the following year. And some of them are quite sarcastic and painful to read. So any budding writer should look at that part of Chekhov's life, because he carried on, and it's his stamina, and he had no other option. That was the hustle of the day. So.
And a very good training for a writer, though, because of course he had a strict word limit and a deadline, and he had to entertain as well. So all those things really made him focus on delivering, because he needed the money too. And 5 kopecks a line, you're not going to earn a huge amount from that. So he wrote a lot.
But yet, at the same time, you have to know, to get the full picture of how hardworking he was, that he was a medical student. He was doing exams. He was doing great. Later on, he was already working at a provincial hospital, and that's all in those years. And he managed to do it all, as well as telling his older brothers off for not supporting the family. I'm going out a lot. You will see the evidence of that in the book.
Right. Yeah. And you can see some of that. There's one story that stuck with me. Since I work as a writer, the story I think was Michajlowska, about all the rejections received. Luckily enough, all my contracted writing work has been for a length of contracted time in news, but so I don't have to deal with actual letters. I just had to deal with editors saying do this again. But yeah, that one struck a chord that was struck close to home for anyone who's ever had to go through something similar.
He's not taking himself seriously.
No,
I mean, that's very autobiographical. I mean, he's not thinking he's ever going to be a writer. I mean, if you think about the traditional Russian writer, there is a sort of stereotypical image. So that's so far from his mind. And, I think he probably would be, as one of our colleagues said, he'd probably be mortified to think that these stories would be so beautifully presented and published all together in English at this point. But so he's not really thinking that it's going to go very far. It's just an amusing pastime and a means to an end.
Right. And maybe this is a good place to talk about the way he viewed these stories. Maybe this is a good time to talk about revisions and what this collection is doing to address. Maybe let's use that word for now. The revisions, which Chekhov did revise these stories both in this, as you point out in your introduction, in this time period as well as later on in life, and that has sometimes led to some confusion when these revised versions are published as if they were the original, which could provide a distorted view of what his writing was like at the time. Maybe you could outline some of that story that you lay out in the introduction, and how it's affected how people see him as a young author.
Yeah, it's a complicated story. So I set out to write the introduction to our book because I've done, so much research into Chekhov, and did the biography. So I just thought, oh well, I'll just do a light-hearted introduction, and it turned out to be much more serious a project than I thought, because I came across the work of an Italian colleague, Giuseppe Ghini, who is based at the University of Urbino in Italy, and he had reviewed one of the anthologies of these earliest stories in English that came out about 20 years ago, and pointed out that not all the stories, in fact, were from that very early period. And he did a couple of scholarly articles about the whole idea of philology and the translation of these works, and looked into the Academy of Sciences edition, which is, this is the sort of the canonic version of Chekhov's stories. It's 30 volumes. There are 10 volumes of stories, and they were published between 1974 and 1983 by, leading Chekhov scholars. It was all very, very good work. They were hamstrung by censorship issues, so there were lots of things missing in the letters and things. But with the stories, because you think, well, it's the Academy of Sciences, you don't really think to question the order of the stories. But what the editors have done is to place whichever latest revision of a story in the collected works, and the original magazine publication is only referenced in the small print at the back in the appendices, and not even printed in full, just line by line where there are variations. And some of the variations are really quite extensive. And some of them, it is true, are quite slight. And they're just sort of commas and very small word changes. But there are a few stories that Chekhov revised at the end of his life quite significantly. So Giuseppe Ghini is quite right to call the whole sort of thing into question, because you're on one page you're reading a story that generally is from 1881, and then the next minute you're reading a story that began its life in 1881 but actually was quite significantly revised in 1899, and that was when Chekhov sold the rights to his collected works. And he was very ill at this point because, of course, he had tuberculosis. He was going to die 4 years later. And he began to go through his stories to select them. And for a start, he didn't actually have copies of most of these early ephemeral stories. It was a business just to find them. And then, he had considerations like, well, this is the complete works of Chekhov now, and Chekhov was the great writer. And so suddenly to have volume 1 bring in these early frivolous stories, it would have seemed insulting to the literary community. So they got sort of sidelined. But there were a couple, and I think if he'd been not so unwell, he would have revised more. Although I think even the earlier stories have value. But it's also incredibly interesting from a literary scholarly point of view to see how he changes them, actually. But nevertheless, what we have is a bit of a mixed bag, because the volume 1, which we've translated, is not all original stories from 1880 to 1882. And even while he's writing them, he's beginning to think about anthologies and making small changes. So it does actually make us think again. And there are quite a lot of Russian publishers that are bringing out anthologies of these early stories and calling them early stories and not taking into consideration that it's not necessarily what it says on the tin.
Mm. Interesting. So a great reason, even if you are big into Chekhov, a great reason to still pick up this collection and start looking around at what you have otherwise in some of your other books and what they say they have. I think you touched a little bit on some of the reluctance to include some of these earlier stories in the complete, like, this is my work, and maybe this is a good time to talk about that publishing these has not been without some controversy in the past, some reservation on Chekhov's part, but also some, you mentioned there have been some people who feel it's almost a disservice that this juvenile young work is attached to the great author, as if it somehow undermines it. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that attitude and how it has appeared.
Rosamund, would you like to say something?
Oh.
You want me to carry on? Yeah, so it was very interesting to research the whole history of the publication of these stories. So Chekhov got a sort of army of friends to start going to libraries in the big cities to actually get copies of them, because he never really kept anything very much of an archive himself. And then he died, and of course there was even more interest in reading stories, and so there was a sort of more concerted attempt to try and gather them all up together. And in the 1940s, in the Stalinist period, we have the first collected works, and that was the first time that they included a section of these earlier stories. Not all of them, they were still researching them. But what was interesting there was that they kept them separate from the later stories, which he had sort of given his seal of approval to by including in his collective work. So it was like they were, not quite of a par as the later writing. And indeed, when they then started thinking about, well, we should have an Academy of Sciences complete collected works that really is much more comprehensive, and we have all the stories now, then there really was a debate, and some of the sort of more crusty Russian writers and scholars were very unsure about whether this work should be placed alongside the later Chekhov, because of how illustrious Russian literature is. But they nevertheless were included. And generally speaking, the stories that we know today are all ones from volume 8, 9, and 10. Those are the famous stories, when he was writing for the literary journals, the New Yorkers of the day. But I think another reason for doing this book is just to sort of shed a light on this earlier period when he was just setting out. And I think it's very interesting to see how a great writer begins. I think Elena and I have both been a bit surprised how even over here now there are people who don't think we should be publishing these stories, who don't rate them and don't see the point in doing them. Wouldn't you say, Elena?
Yes, they look like as if they're embarrassed on the Chekhov's behalf. But to be honest, I don't think your view of Chekhov would be complete without them. It will amaze you how earlier on he starts developing the themes, which we see later. You will see a lot of roots of his great and famous work and the plays, even in those early years. And also, it will help you to understand his really specific sense of humor, I think. Don't you agree, Rosamund? What kind of person he was, and this is where he is the healthiest, the strongest. He's got the whole life ahead of him, no tuberculosis. He's planning the medical career. He's in love, living with in a big city. He's in love with that life, and and lots of women are in love with him. So it's a very different look of him, and you see that in the stories, and they complete the puzzle. They complete the full picture of who he really was. So I think, at first maybe he would have cringed, but then he said, "Oh, it's all right, girls. This is it's okay. You can publish this."
And he's famous, isn't he, for being a very inscrutable
Mm,
writer. He didn't wear his heart on his sleeve, and that was one of the most uh, revelational things for me when I was translating. I was translating for this volume I did for Oxford Wells Classics about love and other stories. It's all his most lyrical stories, and they're all about landscape. And he was actually very open when he wrote about beautiful steppe landscape and so on. But in these stories, he is completely unguarded. And as Elena's right, yeah, we see him completely unbuttoned and full of just irrepressible good spirits, I think, and keen to have fun and to try all kinds of different literary genres too. I mean, there's so much experimentation going on in these stories.
As I'll just add, as one of the Russian writers who endorsed our book, Vladimir Sorokin, he's put it, "This is Chekhov's spring."
Because we only know the autumn of Chekhov, don't we? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is really his spring.
yeah. We talked earlier how that almost has like that the quality of almost being spoken speech, as if you need to read it out loud, and that is I kind of had the sense either it was a stage play or also it's got this kind of ironic way of writing, which is like inviting you in on the joke, not ironic to be insulting to you, but like sitting over a table, kind of like one eyebrow lifted, like telling you this funny story where like you're both in on the joke, which is a lot of fun to engage with. But I will also mention, as you point out in the introduction, that the impression we often have of Chekhov in this era is mostly as a humorist, mostly as a satirist, the humorist more than satirist, but that's not universally true. Most of this is satirical humor, but there's also, he starts touching into some other topics as well. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of like the body of what we're getting in this work.
Yes, towards the end, you see such serious themes as sexual abuse. You see the themes.
Well, more sexual harassment,
yeah,
really.
sexual
It's
harassment.
not, yeah,
Sexual
yeah.
harassment by the rich landowner of her peasants. You see a young wife being effectively sold to her lover by her husband. You see the wasted dreams in the late blooming flowers. Which is actually a really interesting story to look at, because the protagonist is a doctor and from a very humble serf background. So we're wondering if that's a bit of Chekhov himself in that doctor with all those ambitions and what they came to. So it's even though it starts with really absurd little satirical sketches, which you can really picture Chekhov almost saying out loud himself. And then towards the end, he's already transforming into someone as someone you'd recognize later on, and he's beginning to mold his work to fit different publications. Is that right, Rosamund? Because he begins to write not just for the Dragonfly, but for other magazines, and he's trying to fit to their style earlier on.
Yeah, yeah. Lena and I did a talk for the Oxford Slavonic seminar back in November, and actually preparing that helped me realize that, yeah, there were some of these comic journals that actually were a bit more ambitious from the point of view of literature, and it's very clear that he was actually trying a lot harder than we might think. Even at this very early stage, he's already sort of trying on, right at the very end, it's true, but trying on the mantle of being a writer. There's one story called Green Point, which is like a sort of miniature novel with chapters and things, and there are various other stories where he's beginning to think about the prose. There are little paragraphs here and there where he's trying to create a scene, and he is the most incredible lyrical writer when it comes to landscape. His best friend was Levitan, Russia's greatest landscape painter, and so you do see the hints of it, and you get to see also a sort of very unvarnished look at all the things he was reading, because that's coming out. Gogol, a great influence. Turgenev, all these great writers are in the background, aren't they, Elena?
Yes, they are. You should read the end notes. We marked it all.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that was another very long. Yes. Yeah. And I think also with genres. I mean, there's one story about animal cruelty, and not all of them are fiction. There are sort of there's parodies of letters. There's parodies of novels. There's all kinds of things. There's a whole sort of parody of an almanac with lots of spurious recipes, and I particularly like the one for the journalist lunch, which is a menu for Friday the 27th. It's 1, shot of vodka; 2, day-old cabbage soup with yesterday's kasha; 3, 2 shots of vodka; 4, suckling pig with horseradish; 5, 3 shots of vodka; 6, horseradish, cayenne pepper and soya; 7, 4 shots of vodka; and then 8 bottles of beer. I mean, you get a very good sense of how people lived too. And I think we didn't mention so much yet, but the violence in Russian society, the people who get beaten routinely, it's up sort of, that's there in the background too. And it's very interesting to have this sort of social picture of lower class Russian life in this very narrow period.
Halfway through that period, Tsar Alexander II gets assassinated, and that changes the mood in the country, and it affects his work too. Then censorship is turned up a great deal. So that's also another part of this book, is that it's sort of a witness to a very important transition that happened in the Russian Empire. And I think that from that perspective, it could also be interesting, and the context. And as Rosamund said, what's been going on in the lives of simple people. I mean, of course, there are a lot of young men in love and failing, and all those things, because that's the evergreen agenda.
Right.
Yeah, but otherwise, you see the censorship character there. You see
State of Medicine's very interesting too, isn't it? There are quite a few stories with doctors in them, and one which is set in a kind of doctor's surgery, except there is no doctor, because doctors are a very, very new thing at that time. I mean, they had a very progressive form of national health service long before we had one in this country. And before that, they just had these sort of medical orderlies who basically weren't much more educated than the peasants. And there's one hilarious story, isn't there?
rural.
So Chekhov's bringing his sort of medical experience into the world of fiction as well.
Yeah, and as long as we're talking about some of these specific stories, I was wondering if you would like to share some of the standouts from the collection, or just ones that mean something to you. I'm sure they all mean something to you, but one that kind of stands out, the first couple ones you think of when you think of that question.
No, they're so different. But I do like, in particular, the ones that look at Russian rural life, especially the ones with a longer description, and that give you a real sense of how it was at the time. Because the information you get the paintings, you get the census here and there. But I think the way he was looking at that class with a different eye, because he was not that far from it, being grandson of a serf. So
and it's very already it's very you said at the beginning, Elena, about Chekhov's a very forgiving writer. That's such a nice way of looking at it. He had this unbelievable compassion And he was a doctor and a scientist, and there is that incredible objectivity, but there's that sort of deep compassion for the difficult lives that people have, and that informs the humor. It's very warm, and that is something completely new in Russian letters. If you think about the standard novels of Turgenev and Tolstoy set on the country estate, it's either the aristocracy or the peasants, and there's not much in between. No one ever thought that the merchants were interesting to write about until Chekhov came along, pretty much. I mean, with a few exceptions, there's Leskov and Ostrovsky, but to actually bring so many different classes into the world of his stories is something really refreshing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of funny that Tolstoy, as much as he writes about the importance, I was just thinking of War and Peace the other day. I was responding to someone's email, but it made me think of how funny it is for him to talk so much about the historical significance of everybody and not focusing on so few great leaders. And yet in the books we have kind of this similar tendency, nonetheless. Yeah, I have to admit, there's obviously as we're moving forward in this collection, we're seeing the development of it, but there's a calling to me of the very early portions of this collection of the I guess you could call it, I think there's this urge to deconstruct or criticize almost other works of the time, which is a little juvenile, but I do enjoy it. It calls to me a little bit because there's something that just is kind of fun to play around. I think it was maybe it was 1001 Passions or A Terrible Night or what does one usually encounter in novels, tales, etc. That one was, I was sitting, I think I was reading in my lunch hour. I was just kind of sitting there giggling to myself in the office, reading that, seeing how much of that still, some of it obviously very specific to the time and place, but how much of it still felt pretty relevant.
He sort of, he had his finger on the pulse. I mean, he did, all those cliches. He was really good at
it. Yeah, absolutely. Those are most of the questions that I had for us. I was just wondering, something I sometimes like to ask is, for this collection, which obviously you're listening, I hope you go out and buy. I hope this provided a good bit of learning and a good reason to talk about it. But is there anything that you think is worth also mentioning that I haven't already asked about or we haven't talked about so far?
We could mention the dramatization.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. Because you've mentioned some of the stories that are going to be in staged readings. We're having an event to celebrate Anton's birthday on 29th of January, and the book at Pushkin House in Bloomsbury in London. And part of it will be a talk given by Rosamund and myself, but the second part will be staged readings. And just before our conversation, I was talking to Rosamund to say that on Friday we rehearsed it for the first time with a couple of actors, Elizabeth Sniggy and Joshua Diffley, and it was amazing. That's how it works. They work so well. They especially if they lean on melodramatic parts, and they picked up all the humor. They are ready-made sketches. Effectively.
I should just interpolate at this point before Elena continues on that, is that when we set out our early Chekhov translation project, it was with sort of the view that maybe we could find more material for dramatization, because Michael Early, who is a very distinguished theatrical figure in this country. He was the director of the Rose Bruford College of Theatre and Drama for a long time. He worked in theatrical publishing. He's just started a new course in theatre at Cambridge now. And he had the great idea of dramatizing some of the slightly later, earlier stories that I brought out in another anthology I did called The Exclamation Mark. And that was what got taken to the Edinburgh Fringe. That was our Chekhov cabaret in 2010. And so when we did our launch for the early Chekhov translation project, it was some actors from that production who came to do a few of the little sketches, because it was just so funny. And so we thought from the beginning, didn't we, Elena, that actually this would also bring the stories alive. And when Elena and I met in 2007, all those years ago, when the money came forward to fund this lecture series about the stories, I thought, well, it's great if our friend Morris is going to bring people from the city who he works with as a venture capitalist to come and hear about Chekhov as a great short story writer, but they're not going to know anything. And I just thought it would be great to have at least one story read out. So we had 8 evenings, and every time we had a lecture, we had a story read out, and it was really, really engrossing. And that just led us to think about the possibility of turning other stories, because, yeah, he was an innate dramatist, wasn't he? So Elena's been working with Michael Early, who's very generously agreed to direct this little sort of trial portion for our event on the 29th, which incidentally is going to be online as well. If anyone in other parts of the world would like to tune in, you can.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that as well. My actual last question to you is, obviously, you both have a lot on your plate, but is there any projects that you are working on that our listeners should keep an eye out for in the near future? Or a far future? Sometimes that's the case.
Well, I think we want to try out with these dramatizations, and maybe because initially during COVID, Rosamund and I had this idea that we need to support the young actors who really got a terrible start in life. So maybe we can somehow marry the young early Chekhov and the young actors and have them stage somewhere. Nothing concrete, so we'll try it out on the 29th. But also we have some ideas in mind. One is we're gonna employ AI to help us to do a tool to identify Chekhov productions all over the world. What's going on? So we were going to do that, and maybe we'll think about how we can support other people who are doing Chekhov in some sort of small way around the world. But no grand ideas.
It has just occurred to me that which I haven't even mentioned to you, Elena, but we just received, didn't we, a letter from some amazing people who used to work at the Chekhov museums in Taganrog. So there was a museum in the house where Chekhov was born, and one in the shop where Chekhov's father had his, grocery store, and the family lived above it. And these 2 Russians who worked there left Russia in 2022, if I've got this right, and are now based in France, and they've set up a sort of organization that seems a little bit similar to ours, and they've reached out to us. So wouldn't it be great for us to collaborate?
We'll explore collaborations all over the world, but we're definitely not doing volume 2 of Days We Need a Break.
That makes sense. This is probably a break a long time coming. Excellent. Well, thank you both for sitting down with me today. I really appreciate it. It's been, and for all of you listening, I hope you really consider picking this book up. It's a lot of fun. Usually I have to give some kind of disclaimer, like, I know this book's gonna be tough, but it'll be fun. But this one is a really fun read. It's just enjoyable. I was at work. I just, between tasks, I'd pop it open, read a couple pages, you feel a little better, and go back to what I was doing. So highly recommend to you all.
Thank you so much for inviting us to talk about it.
It's definitely a Russian literature without the pain.
Yeah. Maybe we don't have episode taglines anymore. I'll add it back in for this episode. That's a good tagline.
Okay. Thank you so much for having us.
And before I let you go, I wanted to let you know what we're tackling next time. We will be returning to Alexander Dovzhenko's Ukrainian trilogy, going back to the beginning to Zveni Hora. I don't know if we're going to be completing the trilogy, but hey, there's just one movie left, so that might be fun. I've actually been I picked up some books on understanding movies, and I've been going through those in the last few weeks. So hopefully, I can provide you more informed commentary on that. Because admittedly, Movies, although I enjoy them a great deal, is not my forte in the same way literature is. But that's what you'll be looking forward to next time. For now, if you want to help keep the show independent, you can head on over to the website, slaviclitpod.com. There are a few ways to support me financially there. Although, this podcast is free, everything we put out will always be free. It is just a great way to help cover the costs. Like I say many, many times on this podcast, it is not expensive to podcast, but it's also not free. So helping cover those costs helps me out a great deal. But either way, I will be here. I wanted to extend a sincere thank you to everyone who already does support the podcast. As always, the music used in this episode was Staraya Kino by Peremotka. You can find more of their stuff on Bandcamp or Spotify. The links and spelling are in the show notes. You'll hear from me again soon.